Good evening and welcome to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight we focus on language and the brain, the acquisition and processing of language. Cognitive scientists study the uniquely human language phenomenon in many ways, but an unusual resource for such investigations is the rare ability to acquire dozens of languages. The few people with that capability are known as hyperpolyglots. Our guest expert is cognitive scientist Ev Fedorenko. Dr. Fedorenko is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital and the director of the EvLab at MIT. Recently, she was featured in a New Yorker article about exceptional language ability, and she'll explain what this talent reveals about language and the brain tonight. Dr. Fedorenko received her Ph.D. in 2007 from MIT. In 2014, she joined the faculty at Harvard Medical School and MGH. Her lab investigates the brain regions associated with both normal and impaired language processing, and she uses an array of methods that we'll hear about tonight. We are most fortunate to introduce Dr. Evelina Fedorenko. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
And I think to maybe start off, we should get an idea of language just generally. So one of the things that we see commonly now is language of dolphins and language of birds and so on.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between what we mean by human language and these other communications?
There is indeed. All animal species communicate in some way, so there's transfer of information. But one thing that humans can do, and arguably a lot of other species don't do to the same extent, is being able to take a range of communicative signals we have, like words and phrases, and recombine them in new ways to make new complex meanings. So I can share with you any arbitrary thought I have about the world, and in most other animal communication systems, the range of meanings that gets across is just much, much more limited.
The sophisticated animal communication forms have a syntax like you would have in human language?
So that's debated. So syntax is basically a set of rules for how bits of communication signals combine. And there is certainly some structure in a lot of animal communication systems.
Yeah.
So two things that make human language very different is one, the range of communication signals that we have. So for example, the number of words that we have, which refer to all sorts of diverse concepts, and this kind of ability to create almost an infinitude of new meanings. So syntax, a lot of people would say, is present to some extent in some animal communication systems. So there's some structure there. So in things like birdsong especially.
Yeah.
But whether semantic compositionality is present, whether different bits of meaning refer to distinct concepts and then get recombined into a complex meaning, that we just don't know yet. And it's really hard to study because it's hard to know what birds talk about.
Well, and can other animals like report what they had for dinner or talk about 2 weeks from now they're going to do, which is very common with English.
A lot of people assume not, but a lot of that, some animal researchers would just say, look, we just don't know.
I see, the fudge.
Because those questions are really hard to get at, right? You can imagine.
You think,
but,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we have types of languages as well, and moving toward this hyperpolyglot thing, then presumably people learn these different types of languages. Could you remind us about these different types, like case and
Sure. Yeah. So languages differ in many different ways. So one fundamental distinction that, so I should start by saying that there is over 6,000 languages around the world, and a lot of them are very poorly studied and not at all studied by cognitive scientists and neuroscientists. So there is some kind of linguistic descriptions of those languages, but no empirical work trying to understand the processing of those languages. So whatever we've learned comes from a handful of families and a handful of languages. But even from that sample that we have been quite extensively studying, we know that there is a big distinction between languages that use word order primarily to convey complex meanings. So in English, if I say Mary kissed John, you know that it's Mary that's doing the kissing and not John. Right. And even if I say some implausible sentence like the pizza ate the boy, and I ask people, what do you think it means? They'll say, well, it's a crazy meaning, but it means the pizza ate John. It's just weird. Right. Or ate the boy or something like that. And other languages use a very different system to convey complex meanings, and that is they mark the roles that the words play in an event in the words themselves. So they would have something like Mary, actor marker, kissed, John, receiver marker, or something like that. And having those markers allows those languages to move words around in any which way. So for example, languages like Russian, my native language, or other similar languages like Finnish, for example, can move words around very flexibly. So I can say Mary kissed John, Mary John kissed, John Mary, and I can convey the same event because I mark those
subject and
roles
object and
unambiguously.
The verb are. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So with
that's one
case languages, all you have to do is learn how many cases in Finnish. I forget. That's awesome. So we'll come back to that. Now, what about now? There is more and more demand for, say, Chinese, and Chinese is tonal.
That's right.
What does that mean, and what makes that difficult then?
That's a whole other distinction. So all languages use pitch and so intonational contours, right? So my pitch goes up and down as I talk to convey different aspects of meaning. So I can say, I went to the store, or I can say, I went to the store, right? And those are different meanings. But languages like Chinese also use pitch to differentiate word meanings. So the classic example is ma, which with a particular tone means mother, with another tone it means horse, and then there's two other versions of that or something like that. Right. And so that's also something that, you know, as a kid learning that language, you have to learn that pitch in that language can distinguish meanings, which is, you know, similar to how sounds can distinguish meaning in, say, English. It's just a different feature of the acoustic signal that can differentiate.
Right. But it can make it just quite difficult for people to learn after that optimal age and so on. Then, so we have those different types of languages, and we'll come back with that. And then, in terms of language acquisition, there are many cases where, for whatever reason, children have not learned at the optimal time. The brain changes as it matures. What is your take on that? What happens with, say, a delay, and also for second language acquisition? If you learn, as many people do as teenagers, is that a problem?
Yeah, so that has been a rich topic of study for many years. And it does seem that there is a certain age after which some aspects of language are especially hard. And those tend to be syntax, so things like word order rules, where little function words like determiners, like the, cases, go, like cases, exactly, in case mark languages. And also articulation, so production of sounds without an accent, right?
Exactly.
So if you learn a language late in life, you tend to have an accent in a foreign language. And interestingly, other aspects of language learning seem to go just fine if you learn a language later. For example, learning new words. So that seems to be unaffected. In general, it seems like the earlier a child gets exposed to a language, the easier it is for them to learn this mapping between, because language is effectively a mapping between a set of communicative signals and meanings, right? So we learn how words map onto particular concepts in the world, and we learn how combinations of words map onto some complex meanings. And that seems to be easiest to learn when you're little. And it gets...
Can we go to the language areas of the brain? And for things like accent, is there anything about the maturing of the brain, that process, that affects your ability to, learn another language most of the time without an accent?
That's certainly true, but we don't understand yet how that's implemented.
Okay.
But I can tell you a little bit about what we know about language regions in the brain. So people mean many different things when they talk about language. So language involves two directions of communication, right? There's comprehension, so as I'm talking, you're understanding what I'm saying, and right now I'm producing language. So at the very broad level, production is taking a thought in my head and converting it into a linguistic code, a code which somebody else can understand. And in comprehension, you're taking a linguistic signal, and then you're trying to extract presumably the intended thought from it. Sometimes this fails, but most of the time it works, and that's why we can communicate successfully. And so this conversion between thoughts and linguistic utterances is what I have mostly focused on, and that's shown kind of schematically here in the red box. So that's what I refer to as kind of high-level aspects of language. But then there's a lot of kind of helper mechanisms, right? So before we start interpreting linguistic signals, we have machinery in our speech cortices, auditory mechanisms that deal with just processing of the speech signal. So those areas in the brain, for example, don't care if you're listening to your native language or a foreign language. They respond just as strongly. So they care about the acoustic features. But then once you're able to interpret the signal as something meaningful, then these higher order areas will kick in, which I'll show you in just a little bit. And similarly, in individuals who have acquired written language and literacy, they develop parts of their visual cortex that now specialize for processing letters in the script that you have learned. So
that's very clear to you that there is a difference.
Yes, yes. So one way in which this specialized visual region has been important is in showing that you can develop these highly specialized bits of the brain as a function of experience, right? So oftentimes people say, oh, if you have something in your brain that is specialized for a particular function, it must be innate, and that's just not true at all. We now see very clearly that there's these regions which are highly specific. They respond to letters, but not to letters in a script that you don't know. And clearly those we have learned when we're learning to read and need to distinguish between these little black things that all look really similar, but different, very important ways, and we can use them to convey linguistic messages as well. So that's on the side of perception, and then on the side of production, we can output language through our articulators. So there is some parts of the motor cortex that are active when we produce speech. And again, just like the perceptual regions, those articulatory regions, they don't care if I'm reciting Shakespeare or saying ba, 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 ba. Those are just the regions that move our mouth to produce the signals. And then again, if we have literacy, we can type a message or write a message, and so use different parts of our motor cortex. And so what I think is kind of, some may disagree, but I think the most exciting part of language is this ability to convert complex, abstract thoughts into this code that we can share with one another. And that arguably has laid the foundation of human culture and ability to teach each other skills and transfer knowledge over generations. And so that's what I mostly focus on. Here, I'm showing you a set of regions that are active when we produce and understand language. And so these are what I refer to as high-level language regions. So these are the regions that translate between thoughts and utterances.
Before that, can you just tell us which side of the brain is
Sorry, yes. This is, so here I'm showing a projection of language activation. So this is from a whole large number of participants, from 220 participants that we've scanned on a language task. And this is a projection of the left hemisphere.
Okay, so it's that side.
Exactly. And that's where language is predominantly happening in most individuals. Although there is some role to the right hemisphere homologs of those regions, which is also quite poorly understood. But the reason that we know that the left hemisphere regions are more important is that when you have damage to your left hemisphere, you're more likely to end up with language problems.
Okay.
And so that's where the action happens, we think.
So there's your pretty left hemisphere. So what does it mean there?
That's right. So these are basically regions that are active. So the contrasts that you can use to find these regions are contrasts between meaningful and structured language and some control condition which is matched perceptually but doesn't have meaning or structure. So you can, for example, contrast people listening to a story in their native language versus to a story in an unfamiliar language, right, where they're getting a lot of the same similar perceptual input, but they just can't map it onto any representations of meaning that they have
Okay,
in
so
their
does
mind.
that mean that if I listen to you in Russian, and if I don't understand Russian, then that will be processed a little differently? That'll be lighting up a
right.
different area.
That's right.
It's
So
just
this
noise to the brain.
Exactly, exactly. It's, I mean, it's not quite noise. It's a very
Yeah,
particular kind
right,
of
I
noise. So
understand. Right.
in auditory cortex, we have these regions that actually quite recently were shown to be exquisitely selective for speech sounds. So those regions will be working really hard if I speak Russian to you, but this high-level system, not so much, because you can't interpret the signal.
Okay,
Exactly
all
right.
right. Do the same areas get activated by, say, music?
No, so that's a very good question. There's been a lot of debate in cognitive science for many years about the extent to which other forms of complex thought and complex cognitive processing shares machinery with language. So there's a long philosophical tradition where people have argued that basically language lay the whole foundation for a lot of complex thought, including things like arithmetic and logic, and maybe the ability for complex hierarchical planning of action sequences and a lot of things like that. And people have also noted parallels between, say, language and music, as you mentioned, because music is also a complex, hierarchically structured stimulus.
Well, it's just, organized sound.
Right. And so, so this is actually the question that drew me to cognitive neuroscience at first, because I wanted to know if anything that we use for language is specialized for language. Because to understand what the language mechanisms do, it's really important to understand how selectively they engage in processing language versus other kinds of stimuli, because the kinds of computations that go on would be very different if a region, brain region processes both language and music compared to if it processes just language and not music. So those are fundamentally distinct theoretical construals. And so an fMRI, functional MRI, which is what this image that I was just showing you was generated by, is the best method we have to ask whether 2 bits of the brain or 2 bits of the mind, underlying what we're interested as cognitive scientists is the mind, whether 2 mechanisms are shared between 2 cognitive processes, right? And so we can say, take a language task, find regions in your brain that respond during that language task, and then ask, do the very same regions respond when you listen to music or when you engage in solving math problems or something like that? And it turns out that in spite of claims to the contrary, these regions that support language are strikingly selective for language.
Right.
So it seems like all of the other forms of complex thought go on elsewhere in the brain. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat such that we don't know whether language may be important in the development of those capacities. And to do those kinds of experiments, you would want access to kids who didn't get linguistic input. Unfortunately, that doesn't normally happen. But in an adult brain, it seems like the mechanisms that process language do not process other complex inputs, do not engage in other forms of complex thought. And it's very consistent now with also evidence from very severe aphasia.
Okay.
So there is, many people have heard of aphasia as basically referring to general kind of language problems that occur in adulthood after stroke damage or head trauma or something like that. A very interesting case of aphasia from the point of view of cognitive scientists, it's a very devastating condition, but sometimes individuals get really, really severe left hemisphere damage where effectively the whole language system is gone.
You mean both for comprehension and productions, Broca and Wernicke's or something?
Right.
Okay.
That's right. That's right. So they basically lose all of the mappings between thoughts and language. And as of a few years ago, a lot of people vehemently would argue that that would leave you unable to engage in any form of complex thought, and that just turns out to be wrong.
Okay.
So those individuals are perfectly fine doing math and reasoning about others' minds and engaging in solving logic problems. It seems like the only thing they lose is this code, this ability to transfer thoughts into a code that we can share with one another.
Okay, that's
quite
really
striking.
good.
Yeah.
But that's been on like the books for a long time. These whether these things are very specifically organized in the brain. So that's quite good to know. Since you brought up the aphasia issue, it seems as though that's been an area that has been particularly rich in showing some of the specific areas of the brain. Anyway, tell us about it, would you? I don't know which kinds you look at, which aphasias and the language breakdown usually.
So aphasia, aphasia generally refers to a broad class of problems spanning problems with speech perception, with the high-level comprehension or production, and articulation. So it's spanning kind of a whole range of possible problems. The evidence that we've had from aphasia over the many years, and that's kind of the evidence that started the whole field of cognitive science, from Paul Broca and later Wernicke, who reported these patients with problems that seemed, even in those early patients, quite selective to some aspects of language. The reason that evidence has been so valuable is that above and beyond what methods like fMRI can tell us, those methods can tell us whether something is causally important, right? So if I damage a brain region and following that damage you're unable to perform a certain function, it says, okay, this region was really fundamental to performing that function.
Right.
And we can try to make similar kinds of inferences based on functional MRI data, but it's not causal. It's correlational by nature. We can see regions that are active, but only a subset of them may be really critically important for whatever
Could
function.
you tell us, please, a lot of people may not know what Broca's aphasia, the loss of production, the loss of comprehension. Could you give us a little detail on that?
Yeah, so this is actually,
and then we'll find out how you study these things.
So there's many forms of aphasia, and there is no, I would say in the field of neuropsychology, so the field of cognitive science that focuses on patient evidence, I don't think there is clear agreement right now about how to divide up different forms of damage, whether particular regions correspond to particular deficits, but there's certainly distinct types of patients that are observed, right? And so two common kinds are patients that are classically referred to as Broca's aphasia, even though it's not clear whether damage to Broca's area, as it is defined by scientists, leads to that problem. But symptomatically, the problems that they show is that they can't seem to output language. So they can understand things just fine. You can talk to them, you can probe their comprehension, you can do tasks which tap comprehension, and they'll be pretty much fine understanding almost all of language, but they have a hell of a time getting language out. And it's really frustrating and debilitating, and often is accompanied by depression, because it's really difficult when you can't express yourself. Is there a sort of parallel between what most of us go through? You can't recall a name, you can't recall the term for something, and then it comes to you at 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that. But you can almost tell how many syllables, maybe what it starts with. Is that similar to what we're talking about here? And it's a deep question of whether the mechanisms are exactly the same.
No, I meant, is it similar? Is
I think, I would say yes. And basically, it's what you refer to as the tip of the tongue state, where you almost have the word and you can't get it. I mean, some forms of this Broca's aphasia or non-fluent aphasia are really severe, and the person can only output like one syllable, like ba, ba, ba. So they try to do what they can using kind of contextual information, but it's a really limited kind of signal that they can output. But it varies in severity quite a lot, from kind of mild problems with accessing words to basically inability to produce anything but a single syllable or something like that. Another good analogy for thinking about Broca's aphasia is for those of us who lived in less developed countries or old enough to have used telegrams, you can think about the language output where you have to pay for each unit of text, right? And so you can just imagine that for these patients, it's just much more costly. Each bit of information, each bit of signal they produce, they have to pay for it, right? It's really, really difficult. And so if you maybe have heard the term telegraphic speech, it's exactly referring to that analogy, such that when you only have a little bit of signal that you can output, you resort to producing this kind of it's language-like output, but it's not full language, right? You're reducing words,
Yeah.
you're compressing, you're getting rid of all of the function words, you're, maybe manipulating order in a way that's
Right.
making things at least possible to convey something.
Now, do these, with that kind of an impairment, do people sort of know what they want to say, but they are unable to generate the language? Is that the idea?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Then with like something like where the comprehension is affected, like Vanika's or something like that. What's that like?
So the other type of, the other common type of patients is patients with comprehension problems. So there they basically, it seems like they can't extract information from the linguistic signal, and they can output speech just fine in the sense that they can get the words out, but oftentimes the output that they produce is kind of really not very meaningful.
So it could be
they'll
incoherent.
make up words, or the signal will be incoherent.
Okay.
They'll use words in the wrong ways.
Okay.
And so they have some access to words, but they seem to have lost the relationship between words and meanings.
Okay.
So they can't make that linkage somehow.
Okay. All right. So, and there are areas sort of specific for these capabilities. That is.
So that's kind of the historic view.
Okay.
So that's a view that still appears in textbooks. I would say. And I don't want to endorse that view because I think there's a lot of research to be
You're
done.
The expert.
But the current evidence seems to suggest more that it's white matter pathways.
Oh, I see.
That
Okay.
whose
So this
damage
is
results
down
in
lower
this different
in that.
exactly.
Okay.
So it's whatever is connecting these regions that we see projected onto the brain. Whatever goes on that which is a lot of basically wires, right?
Yes,
Wiring up
like
different
wires,
parts of the brain together. So
yeah.
it seems like what explains a lot of the evidence that we see from deficits comes from damage to different kinds of wire bundles, as opposed to particular cortical
So not
regions.
a geography necessarily.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Then the next thing is these language learners. So when you're a child, you can learn a language or two or something pretty
10.
easily. Well, yes, we should get them all
Yeah.
exposed there.
Yeah.
But then, so can you tell us about how you got into this super? There are many people who can speak, say, 4 languages,
right.
5, 6 languages.
Yeah.
It gets, I guess, more rare as you go along.
Yeah.
But you stumbled on this
Yes.
super learner. Tell us about that, if you would, please. And then,
So this topic was the topic of, in general, language expertise has been of interest to me ever since I started looking at language disorders in some way.
I see.
Because it's kind of the extreme case, right? So language disorders lead to some difficulties with some aspects of language. And maybe we can understand something about how the system is broken by also looking at people who are really, really good at some aspects of language.
Yeah.
And what it means to be a language expert can be defined in many different ways, right? Some people have vast vocabularies. Some people are really, really articulate and don't make speech errors when they speak and are really compelling and at conveying ideas or something like that. But one form of expertise is this seeming ability to acquire many, many forms of mappings between thoughts and linguistic forms by learning dozens of languages. It's a very interesting population that hasn't been studied at great depth or any depth really. There's very little work on
That's the first
these
time I've heard of it.
So these are people that normally grow up in monolingual countries, and this is anecdotal so far. So it seems like it's not the case that these are people who already have exposure to a bunch of languages and then want more. But instead they're in these societies where there's one dominant language, and somehow they get interested, and we're launching a website in the near future that will advertise to the polyglot communities once it's up, where we're trying to just get basic information on what drives people to do this. Seems like there's quite a lot of variability on why people get started on this kind of as an odd hobby, or they start learning a language and it's just really easy for them and they're like, okay, I'll try another one. Some people seem to want to read literature in other languages, and that kind of motivates them to try to learn all these different languages. But there's no real systematic review as of yet. But
you're going to write that. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll have enough information soon to do that. But
Yes.
But yes. So the questions we're interested in is, are these people different somehow from the typical population?
Yeah, right.
Are their brains different? Are their processing mechanisms different? What makes them good? Are they good at everything else? Are they just generally smarter than everyone?
Right.
Or is it specific to language? So those are the kinds of questions we're hoping to get at.
And do you have any answers yet?
We
You mentioned that.
Yes.
Astounds me that they come so far
Yeah.
from monolingual cultures.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yes. So far we've conducted one neuroimaging study with hyperpolyglots. So it's actually polyglots and hyperpolyglots. So we have about 8 people in our sample who are between 10 and 55 languages, and then another
55.
Yeah, it just seems. I mean, of course, it's like when you say this, you have to keep in mind that there's a range of proficiency.
I understand.
Right?
I understand.
Almost all the people who have such vast numbers, they'll have, and sometimes quite a few languages at which they're really quite proficient, but then there's a long tail of languages where they've learned something, but would not be able to kind of fully converse with a native speaker. So. For starters, what we were interested in looking at is just the basic properties of the language architecture. So remember I mentioned that the way that we find the language system is we contrast the processing of structured and meaningful sentences or short stories to kind of perceptually match but meaningless information, like, for example, a foreign language. So we've now collected that contrast on a very large number of typical individuals. So we have, in our database, we have over 700 participants. And so I was interested whether relative to that distribution of people, the language regions of hyperpolyglots, when they process their native language, right? Because that's a comparison right now. First, just for basic language processing, is something different about how their brain works when they do that, right? So, does the language topography look the same, or do they process language in some wholly different set of regions? To the extent that it's the same system, are these regions bigger or smaller, or more or less lateralized, right? So those are all the features that we can look at. And so here we're showing brain activations for this language task in 4 polyglots and 4 typical participants. So on the left you see polyglots, on the right you see typical participants, and for these pairs they're really well matched. So they're matched on IQ, general intelligence, they're matched on age, sex, handedness, so they're kind of as matched as you can have them.
Yeah.
And what you can see is that the general topography that emerges,
very different.
Right.
I would have reversed
it's similar in where it is, but the size of the regions is really quite strikingly different. So what we find is that polyglots just don't activate the same language system to the same extent. And this is really interestingly parallel to what we've known about efficient processing and motor learning. So there's been a few studies over the last couple decades showing that when people learn a new complex motor task, they activate large chunks of their motor cortex. And as they get better and better and better, the activations kind of shrink.
Just less energy.
Exactly.
More efficient processing.
Exactly. But it's interesting because a priori, I could have predicted something like the opposite, right?
Yes,
because you could imagine that polyglots, when they process language, maybe they process much more richly, right? And construct, much more complex representations of the signal or something. But it seems like that's not the case, and at least so far, based on the sample we have, which is like 20 people, it seems like they don't have to work their language regions, quite as much.
That is really interesting.
We thought so. And another interesting thing is that it's not the case that they just have reduced activations for anything. So we had also a control task, which was a demanding working memory task where you had to remember a set of locations. And for that task, it looks very similar between polyglots. So it's not like there's some ubiquitous reduction in activation for anything.
But it's also distinct areas then here. These are truly language areas lighting up.
Yeah.
So once again, the ones on the left are the polyglots.
That's right.
And the ones on the right are
controls.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
matched controls.
Monolinguals or
Yeah.
something. Oh, that's very,
Yeah.
very
So
clever.
something is working less.
Exactly.
Cells are firing not as much,
Right.
which is the signal that we're trying to measure with fMRI indirectly through blood flow changes.
Exactly.
But yeah, so that's interesting, and there's many other questions that we're asking. So we also asked. We looked at the processing of different languages in polyglots.
Like different types of, or
so
just
far,
languages?
just different languages in
Okay.
terms of proficiency. So
Okay.
every polyglot, every hyperpolyglot can say, okay, here's a rank order of the languages
Okay.
in how well I know them.
Okay.
And we looked at how the language regions respond to languages in terms of proficiency, and we generally find that there is kind of a drop-off as people become less and less proficient. So to me, this suggests that basically the activity in this language system indexes kind of how much meaning you can extract from the signal. So for example, I don't know if you speak like a little bit of Spanish maybe or something. So if I talk to you in Spanish, maybe you would activate your language system a little bit less than English, but still a lot more than, for example, for Russian, which you may not know at all.
Well,
right?
there is a level of expertise in the number of languages, so they're not necessarily equal proficiency all the way through, but
That's
they
right.
still acquire languages with much less effort than a lot of other people
It's
do.
actually
They are
not
drawn.
clear.
Ah.
The effort part is not clear.
Ah.
There is actually there's certainly some hyperpolyglots who say, I'm not sure if it's easier for me to learn these languages. I work very hard to learn them. I
Okay.
enjoy it. I enjoy the
Okay.
process, but it's not easy.
Right.
And then there's other polyglots who say, yeah, I find that it's kind of fun and no effort at all. I just get this information and I can just easily pick it up.
I see.
Again, so this is something that we're hoping to study through these
Yes.
behavioral surveys of as many polyglots as we can access. It's possibly correlated also with how people learn languages. So there are
Yes.
some polyglots and hyperpolyglots who learn from books or textbooks, like I would, for example, learn from a foreign textbook. And there's others who just go out to a marketplace and just strike conversations with people who speak a different language and try to figure something out, which to me as a kind of your canonical socially introverted academics seems really hard.
Exactly.
And yet some people seem really good at that.
Right.
They can just, so maybe they have really good social skills such that they can
Right.
leverage that in some way to extract some meaning and then eventually, build off of that or something
Exactly.
like that. But again, I would like to be able to say that, 40% of polyglots prefer learning this way and 20% of this, and we just don't know yet.
Okay, that's good. And another thing, just on that, is that there might be a difference in the type of language, like everyday language has a vocabulary this big, and then reading language is much different, the structure, everything is much different, so that may weigh in there also.
Indeed.
But in our remaining time, I would like to ask about your methods, and you've mentioned fMRI a lot and so on. When you mentioned the wires in, like, say, the white matter and the gray matter, these layers in the brain, does fMRI capture the stuff that's in the white matter,
So
for
there's
example?
so magnetic resonance MRI itself can be used to study white matter.
Okay.
So there is basically different sequences that capture different aspects of the brain signal. In this case, it's anatomy, right? So it's a static thing. So fMRI is something, functional MRI is something that dynamically changes as we process information. But then we can also take just pictures of static anatomy and say, how big is your inferior frontal gyrus? Or let's look at your bundles, right? And for looking at the wire bundles, there's different kinds of sequences that we use, but we can do that.
So you might have different techniques or
That's
equipment or technology to
it's the same
approach
machine,
what you're
and
going
you can
after.
I mean, you can think of it like MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, is a very versatile technology, right? I can scan people who may have a tumor in their liver, right? And I can also look at to use it. So it's a versatile tool, and we use it in different ways to look at, for example, brain anatomy versus brain function. Sometimes trying to relate those to each other, or different aspects of brain anatomy, like white versus gray matter and things like that. that.
And is that your primary approach then? I guess
So
everybody's
far.
using this. Well, apparently it can do so much. So that was just...
It can, yeah. So one thing that it can do, one thing that it's really lacking is being able to track the processing of information really fast. So it measures the signal that is related to blood flow changes.
Yes,
so when your particular
see.
brain region works, cells fire,
Right.
and then they get depleted in oxygen and glucose, and new oxygenated blood has to come in and bring new supplies to that area,
Okay.
and that's the signal that we measure, those changes. And that takes a few seconds. So if I show you a sentence, it'll take about 6 seconds in the language regions to see an increase in response.
I see.
Right? Whereas, of course, we understand language on much faster
I
time
understand.
scales.
Right.
And so for questions where we're interested in when something happens as we're processing language online fast, we turn to methods which have higher temporal resolution. So there's a method called magnetoencephalography. So this is also using somewhat similar signals, but not quite in the same way.
Okay.
So MEG, and there we have the ability to track exactly when things happen, and that's really helpful. We'll lose a little bit of the ability to know where the signal came from,
Okay.
but we can know when different kinds of information become available or become processed. And another method that's kind of becoming really, really invaluable to cognitive science is intracranial recordings. So every now and then, patients with epilepsy would need to undergo a surgery for resection.
Okay.
And so while, and basically what usually happens is that they have the first surgery and then they get implanted with some grids right on their brain. Okay, sometimes there's also depth recordings from things that are not accessible from the surface, but a common thing is to put a grid right on your brain, right? And then you typically wait for the next seizure to happen to figure out where the epileptogenic cortex is so that you can resect this and hopefully
That's
these people,
amazing.
yeah, it's great that this can happen. And it's actually amazing how much of the brain you can cut out without subsequent problems. But anyway, while they're kind of in the hospital for a few days waiting for that next seizure, you can come and kindly ask them to read some sentences or listen to music or do whatever tasks, and then we can get very precise temporal and spatial information.
Yes.
And that's been, and it's very precious data. There's not many patients who undergo these procedures, but we try to, make the best of this.
Well, you're in the best area. I mean, the MGH and Harvard Medical School together.
Yeah,
You've
and
got
other
it all sewed up, and and in your lab.
Yeah.
So this is fabulous. It seems as though this technology is really helpful. It really gives you like there's less ambiguity or something in
for some questions. It's great.
Yeah,
for some questions, it's really been invaluable.
But language is difficult. There's no question about it.
Yeah, because we have no animal models. So like we started this conversation, right? There's some aspects of language, like the basic motor control of articulators, or basically basic perception of the speech signal that you can kind of study in monkeys. But beyond that, it's just really different. And so and we can't mess with human brains on purpose.
That's right.
We can try leverage data from strokes, but strokes are messy and they don't cleanly affect language. So it's challenging. So studying language and other high-level abilities like high-level theory of mind, thinking of other people's minds, those things are harder to study than say vision.
Absolutely. But I get the sense that you're looking down the line at that sort of thing. You have is this your main focus at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I make even a small dent in my lifetime in understanding language, that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be
This is just such a
there's still many things that we don't understand.
Right.
I am interested in also how language, which is evolutionarily quite a late invention, how it interacts with other systems that have been there for phylogenetically much longer. So our general memory and attention mechanisms, or the systems that support social or emotional processing.
Right. I would say math also.
Yes,
a lot of abstract areas.
Right. So exactly.
They're very late. They're vulnerable. They're late to develop. All of that.
Yes. And there's also, so interestingly, even though things like math and logic happen in areas that are completely non-overlapping with language, as I mentioned, there's interesting properties such that they tend to be in the left hemisphere, for example. And so we're currently trying to understand whether there is a relationship between, for example, how lateralized language is in people versus how lateralized math and logic are
Or
in those same
music, or
people,
a
whether
lot
it's
of these
exactly
kinds
whether
of
those things go
things.
together.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe there is some underlying drive, and that could be because language is really key in the development of some of these abilities.
Right,
and
right.
that
The
would
brain
make sense,
is a
yeah.
wee bit complicated.
Yeah,
Right.
there's a lot of stuff going on, but we'll
Yeah.
crack it.
Well, you have
Yeah.
a lifetime of work cut out
Yes,
for you.
we do.
I wish you the very best. You
Thank
know,
you.
what a very rich, interesting area. And you're
have
right
fun.
in the, it seems like the middle of the universe around here, you know, to work on
it's
it.
a great place to be.
It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Thank you
so
very
much.
much for joining us.
Fun talking
Thanks.
to you. Thank you.
Okay.